Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 6436 in the name of Iain Smith on the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee's report on banking and financial services in Scotland.
I now call on Rob Gibson to wind up on behalf of the committee. Mr Gibson, about 8 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In summing up for the committee, it's my great pleasure to have been involved in an inquiry that enhances the reputation of this Parliament and all of the parties that took part in it, to the witnesses, to the clerks, to our adviser, Philip Auger, and indeed to recognise that this is perhaps one of the most central issues, not just of this time, but of all generations, the way in which we regulate finance, the way in which we promote a future for the financial services in a country which has over 300 years of experience of creating some of the most sound, long-term financial organisations in the world, in terms of asset management, in terms of insurance, asset servicing and so on. But to counter that, we have probably to take Gavin Brown's original stricture that we should be trying to direct our thoughts to things that we can deal with here, directly or indirectly, from Scotland. But if we were to narrow that down and say, what could we do now, then the restraint on us from the powers which we do not have in order to be able to regulate financial markets are huge. There are whole issues about the way in which we would want to look at that in the future. And I think the committee was bombarded with the many arguments about how financial institutions, in particular banks, ought to be organised. And I think part of the problem is that because of the uncertainties of another year of discussing this, which Ross Finney described, that we're going to be left between should it be Glass-Steagall or should it be what Adair Turner has suggested, which is a slightly different route. Adair Turner's involvement in this is to suggest that, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, it's very difficult to separate out investment banking from retail banking, because it's been argued that investment banking provides cash for the economic recovery through its activities then funnelled into the commercial side of things. Indeed, if that is so, then living wills have to be looked at in terms of these too large to fail organisations, and indeed riskier operations and deals must require a higher amount of capital be carried by those institutions. So it is a complex issue from that point of view. Breaking up the banks could do considerable damage to these institutions in Scotland, and that's why when you talk down Scotland and say, should the Royal Bank, or imply that the Royal Bank should be smaller, that HBOS part of it should be smaller, you're actually not addressing the potential of the financial services in a global market based from here. And it's not a question of under which governance that they are faced, but actually in terms of the way in which they operate in terms of a kind of wider sense of global organisation. We know at the present... Yes, certainly.
Ross Finney.
I don't want to be semantic, but do you not think, therefore, that that is why it is important to talk about, why it is necessary to talk about whether a bank is too important in its function, rather than to define it as being too big, and that that is the very point you've just been making?
In my notes, the question about too important to fail, which Ross Finney said, Presiding Officer, is something which I think we have to take to heart. But that should be something we can address fairly quickly. There are many different kinds of views about the importance of various parts of this report, and people have spun off arguments from it to suit their particular political circumstances. And the question of the OFT and so on has to open up the whole issue about the regulatory framework which was set up and built upon in the last period of time. The various government bodies which have had a life which has extended the range of institutions which look after our interests. Now, the FSA, in its separate role, has played some useful functions since the crisis. We've heard Adair Turner talking about these. The question of who should control that is another matter which no doubt this Royal Commission will be looking at. The Bank of England, in its overview of the macroeconomy, didn't see this coming either and didn't tell the FSA it should be getting on with a particular job. As for the Office of Fair Trading, well, we've experienced in terms of simple things like the regulation of the wholesale market in milk, that they were not prepared to look at the Scottish circumstances separate from others. And therefore, this committee would have to take a view that the jury is certainly out on whether the OFT is a fit, structured body for dealing with the kinds of investigation which many members across the chamber have been calling for. Now, talking about various other aspects in the report, Marlon Livingston agreed with Linda Fabiani that cooperatives and non-profit types of banks organisation would be a good thing. Well, these are often regulated under the British legislation which we have at the moment, and I'm wondering whether members would agree that that ought to be part of the discussions about having devolution of some of these functions in order to encourage the creation of more cooperative banks. The true purpose of banking, which was talked about by Iain Smith, was also actually talked about by Jamie Hepburn, and the examples he gave, which other people may have disagreed with, show a result of globalised banking which is out of control of so many different sorts of people. Now, there are far too many aspects of the whole report that need to be looked at for us to actually have the time to deal with them in detail. But this debate in itself has allowed us to see that this committee will have to have not just a watching brief, but in every year of our existence, this subject as a major part of our remit from now on, and that we should be very pleased that the kind of evidence which we have to base this debate on will allow us to go forward with a very much more forensic approach. I'd just like to refer members to an old quote that I found just recently by Neil Asherson, who wrote in his Observer column in 1987, which is entitled "The No-Go Area of the Square Mile." He wrote that a good government would go into the city with drums beating and clean it out, destroying nothing that the economy really needs in the process. A good government, he said at that time, which we do not have. Unfortunately, a lot of the evidence that this committee heard showed that we did not have a good government during the period of that crisis, and the jury is out as to whether we will have a good government that is capable of actually finding the ways forward to create the structures for our financial services which will give Scotland that kind of sustainable future which we all seek.